All right, good evening and welcome to the first panel for the Child Neurology Foundation's 2021 Patient Advocacy Summit. We're happy for you to be here with us this evening. My name is Katie Henches and I'm the Director of Programs for the Child Neurology Foundation. It is our inaugural Transition of Care Patient Advocacy Summit, and we believe that the patient voice and experience is an integral part of the successful transition from pediatric to adult care. This summit focuses on centering those voices and experiences, ensuring that these young adults and those who support them have the knowledge, tools, and confidence to be able to make the process successful. In addition to this summit, CNF offers other resources in the transition of care space. Feel free to check them out on our website. They are in both English and Spanish at www.childneurologyfoundation.org/transitions. These resources and our summit would be impossible without our partners. We are able to put on summits like this for free today, thanks to the generous support from our sponsors on the screen. This is Acadia, Biogen, Eisai, Genentech, Greenwich, and Zogenix. And we hope that if this session resonates with you, that you find it helpful in advocating for yourself, and you are able to, we would love for you to make a donation to the Child Neurology Foundation. It'd be helpful in continuing our efforts and providing first-class programming. Feel free to check out our website at www.childneurologyfoundation.org/donate-online. All right, so tonight we have a panel. It's titled Advocating for Equitable Environments and Policies for Children and Young Adults with Neurologic Conditions. We have Yahaira Lopez, and she is the founder of Autism Sprinter Incorporated, a parent-led grassroots organization building parents as experts, in addition to her firsthand experience raising twin boys on the autism spectrum who also experience ADHD. She has over 15 years of experience working with children and youths in places like Boston Public Schools, the Boston Center for Youth and Families, and currently serves as a family partner for Riverside Community Care Mobile Crisis Unit. Her work is dedicated to improving the lives of families and their loved ones by empowering them to navigate the social systems that are impossible to understand. We're also joined by Ari Ne'eman, who is working on the national disability rights activism for more than 15 years. He currently serves as a senior research associate at the Harvard Law School Project on Disability and is a visiting scholar at the Laurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis. He is the co-founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, served for 5 years as one of President Obama's appointees to the National Council on Disability, and is currently working on a PhD in health policy at Harvard University. And last but certainly not least, we have our panelist, Cara Liebowitz. Cara is a DC-based activist, sensitivity reader, and writer with multiple disabilities. She works in fundraising, grant writing, and partnerships for a national disability rights nonprofit. By night, she reads both fiction and nonfiction, watches Star Trek, and has long conversations with her cat. Please join us in welcoming all of our speakers tonight. We are so happy to have them here to share their experiences and insights. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Nick Grand, a program manager at the Child Neurology Foundation who supports programs related to transitions of care. Before we get started, I do have a few comments about logistics, some housekeeping. So this panel is being recorded. It will be available for all registrants on the password protected hub after the event. Please remain muted while the panelists are speaking. There will be designated time for you to unmute yourself and ask questions. Feel free to use the raise hand button in the reactions area at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to submit comments and questions using the chat feature, as CNF staff will be monitoring that as well. If you feel comfortable doing so, we encourage you to leave your video on during this event, because we'd love to build some community. But if you have a distracting background or you feel more comfortable having your video off, please feel free to do so. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Jessica.
Thank you for that, Katie, and welcome to everybody. And thank you again to our panelists for being here. So as Katie said, we're going to hear from our three esteemed panelists this evening, and then there'll be time at the end that is designated for question and answer and comments, but we certainly encourage you to share comments and ask questions at any time using the chat feature. We just ask that while our panelists are speaking that you remain muted just so that we can all hear everybody. And with that, I will pass it over to Yahaira, who is going to tell us a little bit about who she is and some of the exciting things that she's been up to.
Hey guys, how are you? So I'm Yahaira Lopez. First of all, I'm a mommy of two amazing boys. They were born prematurely. One of them is on the autism spectrum. The other one has ADHD. So I kind of say my house is like a bag of Skittles. You open it up, you don't know what you're gonna get. So that's how our household operates. It's like fun chaos, right? I started Autism Sprinter in 2014 while also working for Boston Public Schools and kind of seeing the difference between working in a public school system than becoming a parent of a child who has unique abilities and having to navigate systems. And I kind of seen the inequities and seen a lot of the parent frustrations when I'm in the inside trying to kind of help families navigate systems. So I kind of found myself to be one of those parents. And in 2014, I decided to depart from the public school system because I kind of felt like my son wasn't getting the help that he deserved while I was also working in a sub-separate setting, working with children like my son, helping other people's children while my son was in a different school in the same district that I was working in, with a teacher who kind of had her own personal things going on. And she was out of the classroom more than she was in. So the first 2 years that my son started public school, after he aged out of early intervention, he didn't have any consistency. So I kind of decided to take my mom role and go from mom to advocate. So I call myself the momvocate, so meshing mom and advocate together. And I decided to depart Boston Public Schools, stay home with my son. And, I was determined to get him to develop his speech before he entered first grade. So I self-taught myself through YouTube University, free 99. I didn't have to get licensed and stuff like that. So I went to YouTube University. I Googled or searched for YouTube videos on how to do occupational therapy, speech, ABA. I self-taught some small sign language techniques. And I kind of just went and did my own thing with my son. I turned one of my bedrooms into a full-blown classroom. And I just, took matters into my own hand. And in the process of doing that, I was recording myself and I was posting the videos and the techniques that I was learning and posting them on Facebook. And one of my childhood friends and somebody I went to college was like, hey, you got to do something with that. I'm like, do what? They're like, oh, you should start blogging. And I'm like, blogging? Like, I don't have time for that. And so, one of my college friends, was very instrumental in the development of Autism Sprinter. He actually bought me the domain and we kind of like launched this website and with the purpose of really giving parents of color the opportunity to really publicly and apologetically talk about disabilities. As a Latina woman, I can tell you that, talking about disabilities and mental health was not a table talk conversation in my household. So while I'm experiencing this, I was determined to kind of break the stigma and break these gaps in my community to really bring forward autism and disability in color and mental health in color. So, started Autism Sprinter, and from 2014 to now, a lot of our work is dedicated to, give parents in the BIPOC community the resources and the help that they need to navigate systems successfully. And be civically disobedient and while you're kind of navigating systems. So, I'm just here, and I, call myself a political agitator, and, I like to be civically, disobedient when it comes to systems, and holding people to task, to making sure that children in low-income communities and communities of color have access to disability resources, and children who are navigating special education in low-income public schools are treated with respect and deserve the same access as their peers in different communities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Can't wait to have some conversation about the ways that that myself and the others here can really model our advocacy after some of the things that you've been doing. Ari, do you mind sharing a bit of your story with us?
Sure. So wonderful to chat with you all. My background is in the autistic community. In 2006, I and a number of other autistic adults co-founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN. And the reason we did that was at the time, there was an unprecedented amount of public discussion of autism, but it was very much something about us without us. Generally, we saw parent voices rather than the voices of autistic people ourselves, or provider voices, parent and provider voices dominate the autism conversation. And that was something we very much wanted to change, in part because there has really been an unfortunate tendency, if we look at the history of autism service provision and autism policy, of siloing off autism from the broader developmental disability and the broader disability rights framework. We tend to see autism service provision approached with a default assumption of segregated, separate services rather than service provision in inclusive, integrated settings in the broader community, inclusive schools, inclusive classrooms, inclusive neighborhoods. It's what we want to see, but unfortunately, historically, that's really not been the focus of traditional autism advocacy. And there's been, historically, a concerning emphasis on causation and cure rather than quality of life, service provision, and support. So ASAN was really founded to try and address that. I ran ASAN's work for 10 years. I'd be glad to chat a little bit about what went into building a successful nonprofit organization, still very involved with the organization. I served for 5 years as one of President Obama's appointees to the National Council on Disability. And currently, I research disability policy and disability service provision. I'll just add one additional thing because I think it's a useful framing device for this conversation. I'm a big believer in exporting the disability rights revolution. I think one of the great innovations of the disability rights movement is to develop a set of ideas that have broad applicability for people with a wild range of different diagnoses, lived experiences, and conditions, that this really represents something incredibly powerful that we have, I would say, an obligation to bring to more communities and more places, because it sends this crucial message that rather than focusing on trying to change people with disabilities, we can work to create a more inclusive society. And a lot of my work historically has focused on trying to bring disability rights messaging to new places. We always say ASAN is a disability rights organization run by autistic people more than it's an autism organization. And similarly, in recent years, I've had the pleasure of working with folks in the rare disease community to try and bring the disability rights framework to many of their frustrations with insurance companies and utilization management practices like step therapy and prior authorization, denying access to life-saving pharmaceutical treatments. I've had the pleasure of working with folks in the substance use disorder community on bringing a disability rights perspective to things like harm reduction, and many other related topics. there is tremendous potential for the ideas of the disability rights movement to revolutionize and politicize a wide array of different disability communities. And I look forward to being in conversation with all of you as to how we continue to advance that goal.
Thank you for that, Ari. And Cara, can you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you fit into this advocacy work?
Absolutely. I feel a little intimidated going after Ari. He's a great friend and a great speaker, but I still get a little intimidated. My name is Cara Liebowitz. I am a multiply disabled activist, writer, and sensitivity reader. I have multiple neurological disabilities, including cerebral palsy, ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. And while that's not a neurological condition, it is very much disabling for me. And I often say that I live at the intersection of physical disability, psychiatric disability, and chronic illness. I've been advocating somewhat informally since my early teens, as I sort of discovered disability rights in the early 2000s internet, and discovered that there was a world out there where people like me were talking and writing and organizing. I was a blogger for many years. I was one of 20 youth with and without disabilities to be selected to participate in a National Youth Inclusion Summit in 2010, which resulted in a global inclusion campaign called I Am Norm. I was involved in the National Youth Leadership Network, which very sadly does not exist anymore. So I've been advocating sort of as a side job for many years. And then for the last 4.5 years, I have been working in advocacy as the development coordinator for the National Council on Independent Living, where I handle all of our fundraising, grant writing, and partnerships, including sponsorships, exhibiting, and advertising for our annual conference, which is coming up in July. So I've done a lot of advocacy over the years, and some of it is big and some of it is small. And advocacy can be small or big. You don't have to think of advocacy as this big, scary thing that people do professionally. It can be as simple as telling your parents or your teachers what you need, or as big as advocating for national policy change. And it's valid, whether it's circulating a petition or posting a tweet or meeting with your legislators in DC. There's a lot of talk that's gone around the past couple of years about armchair advocacy and how armchair advocates aren't real advocates. You are a real advocate no matter what you're doing. And armchair advocacy is as a term is extremely degrading and ableist. For a lot of us, posting a tweet or signing a petition is all we can do. Sometimes it's all we want to do, and all of that is valid. So I just want to affirm that advocacy is valid no matter which way you do it.
Thanks so much for that, Cara. We're going to take the time now to ask you some questions that have come in from our registrants earlier this week. But just as a reminder to you all here, we encourage you to use the chat feature or to raise your hand using the feature that we called out during the slide deck when Katie introduced this panel to participate in the conversation as much as feels comfortable to all of you. So just a sort of general question before we begin. All three of you talked about inclusive environments and working towards inclusion. And the title of this panel talks about advocating for equitable environments. And I'm wondering if one of you or all of you could talk about what we mean when we say those terms and how that's different from saying that we're working for equal environments or we're working for diversity in disability representation. So could one of you just just tell me a little bit about what those words mean?
So I'll take a first stab at that, if that's okay with the two of you. From my perspective, I think it's very important that we be very specific about our vision for disability service provision. And, you know, that's despite the fact that you can have bad disability service provision environments, whether we're talking about special education or long-term services and supports or voc rehab or any number of other things that come in all different forms, right? It is always possible, no matter what service model is being adopted, to have something that is condescending or patronizing or disempowering. Having said that, there are some service models that are at greater risk for that than others. And we have, you know, a wealth of decades of research and experience and advocacy to really inform that. You know, in the context of adult services, we have a pretty broad array of research that shows that people tend to have more autonomy, more control over their own lives when they are in settings that are non-congregate in nature, when they are in their own, living in their own home or living in an apartment where they have a lease with maybe 1 or 2 roommates at most. We really have tried over the course of the last few decades to move away from congregate care. Really, you know, whether we're talking about large institutions, a sort of traditional model of congregate care, or even more, you know, recent, smaller modes of congregate care like group homes, there has been, I think, a tremendously important shift away from that, because there is a recognition that even people with the best of intentions in these types of service, providing services in these types of environments, because of their structure, because of the way they operate, tend to deprive people of autonomy. And it's very similar in the educational context. We have, I would say, a growing amount of information that really shows that people do better academically and otherwise in inclusive settings rather than in segregated settings. Now, the tricky thing here, of course, is that we need to individualize services around particular people's needs. But, you know, when we talk about individualization, I think it's important that we create a menu of options that are consistent with what we know to be best practice. So there are lots of different forms of inclusion. There are lots of different forms of service provision, of community-based service provision, but we also know that there are some things like institutionalization that we should be taking off the table. And there are some things that we might have thought were a good idea in prior generations, like smaller forms of congregate care, that we really need to be phasing out over time. So to me, when I think about inclusion, I try and get as brass tacks as possible. How do we alter our funding systems and our service systems to move away from models that do not reflect our values?
And I'll follow up with that. You know, I think for me, and being from Boston, and also being a person of color, living in the low income community, and, you know, in the marginalized and oppressed group, that I think that in our community, when we're talking about equity and inclusion, we're a little bit behind. We're fighting to get there. I mean, we still have a lot of inequities in our public school system, especially communities of color, and communities where there is low voter turnout, that there is less civic engagement. You know, you know, a lot of the children in our communities are like literally the poster children to the school to prison pipeline. And so when we're talking about special education and equity, I think about those issues. But I would say that for me, in our community, we're very behind in accessing those services. And part of the work that we do is to ensure that communities, especially those that are marginalized, understand that there are services available. The issue is the majority of the nonprofits that offer these services and help are not in the urban community. They're not in low income communities. So a lot of families have to travel outside of their own community to get, you know, a developmental specialist, you know, to get a diagnosis, right? Even though most hospitals and many, you know, community health centers may have some, but in order, if you want to get a second opinion from like a different top-notch doctor, you're leaving your community. And for families that don't have access to vehicles, or I have to navigate through multiple different transportation systems to get to, you know, let's say, for example, the Laurie Center here in Lexington, Massachusetts, right? That has really great reviews. So, you know, when I think about equity, I'm just thinking about how communities of color who are navigating disability, we are still limited to access and resources because they're not in our communities. So that's kind of like, and just also, again, kind of talking about the limitations in our special education systems and, you know, not having, you know, the conversation about, do we have doctors that speak Spanish? Do we have disability doctors that speak Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean Creole? We're kind of still behind those times, trying to play catch up to what a lot of other communities may know about and have access to compared to our communities.
Yeah, and I would just, I would add on that by saying, I think when we talk about equity and equality and access, we're really talking about access to opportunities and experiences. You know, I'm a part-time wheelchair user. If there is an accessible entrance to a restaurant, but it's around the back blocked by 3 garbage cans, and you have to go through the kitchen, and then you have to go through an elevator that's, you know, being used as a storage closet. That's not equity. I may get to the restaurant in the end, but I'm not getting that same experience that everybody else is getting, you know, going through the front door and being greeted by a server and, you know, whatnot. So, you know, it's kind of all about, again, access to experiences, access to opportunities, and that's going to look different for some people. You know, we talk a lot in the disability community about access to work, you know, and there's a strong emphasis on, you know, people with disabilities can work. People with disabilities absolutely can work, but sometimes people with disabilities can't work, or they work in different ways, or they're going to have to, you know, require some reasonable accommodations that require a little bit of out-of-box thinking, maybe a reduced schedule, or maybe their work isn't paid, maybe their work is volunteer, you know, especially in the US where so many people are being trapped by the poverty cycle of Medicaid and Social Security, who can't work for fear of losing their benefits. You know, so sometimes equity is going to look different for each person. And I think that's really what we mean when we say equity versus equality.
Thanks so much for that. And as you are all speaking and answering those questions, something that kept echoing is something Ari said in his introduction about exporting these advocacy techniques and working intersectionally and working across social movements. And of course, there are you know, there are certainly disabled people of color, and there are disabled people who are queer, and there are poor disabled people who are disabled and poor. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words right now. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, if you have all had experience in doing that exporting work and in building bridges across some of these other advocacy movements outside of the disability or chronically ill communities.
Yeah, I can start out about that. I've done some work. I identify as asexual, and I've done some work in that community, just kind of as I was figuring out my own identity. I realized that there's a lot of toxic narratives around disability in the asexual community. A lot of, you know, asexual people say, you know, asexuality isn't an illness, it's not a disability. And that, you know, excludes those of us who are disabled and asexual. And, you know, meanwhile, you have people in the disability community who say, people with disabilities have sex, we're not asexual. Well, some of us are asexual, and asexual people may have sex, they may not have sex. You know, it's all about those feelings of attraction. So I started writing on this a few years ago, really trying to bridge those gaps and really trying to counter some of those harmful narratives. And I was actually interviewed by a journalist whose book on asexuality came out, I think a few months ago. Her name is Angela Chen, and her book is called Ace. And it's all about exploring asexuality and what it means, and, asexuality as a broader part of the LGBTQ plus movement. And so she interviewed me for her book, and there's a, lengthy chapter on asexuality and disability, which I really appreciate, because people with disabilities, though our disabilities may be a big part of our lives and they may be a big part of our identities, or they may not, it depends on the person. For me, my disabilities are a very big part of my identity, but there are other things that are part of our identities too. I am a Jewish woman, I am asexual, all of those feed into my identity. I'm originally from New York, I'm a New Yorker, that feeds into my identity. So we're not one note. And I think we like to say in the disability community sometimes, we're not defined by our disabilities, but I think it's more accurate to say we are defined by a multitude of things, including our disabilities.
So something I've really enjoyed over the course of the last several years is working with other communities, even communities I'm not a part of, to try and bring some of the ideas and the tactics of the disability rights movement to them. I mentioned earlier that I have, over the last few years, spent a lot of time working with folks from the rare disease community, and in particular on trying to address some of the challenges that they face from insurers and others that really have deemed the treatments that can play a hugely impactful role in their lives. And I'm thinking, in particular of some of the major innovations we've seen in cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy, a number of other communities. There's a real problem where insurers and other payers are very reluctant to make those available to people. Historically, I would say the conversation on those things has adopted a frame that tends to focus on the human cost, which is very, very real, and highlighting how painful that is. And I think it's important to continue to highlight that. But I think it's also important to introduce words like discrimination and introduce constructs from disability rights law into these discussions. And that's particularly the case given that often what's done is not just out and out denials, but putting in place tremendous amounts of administrative burden to make it very difficult for people to get access to needed care. There is a very common experience, I would say, in large parts of the disability community, not just the rare disease community, with dealing with insurers putting in place step therapy protocols, which require people to fail on your insurance company's choice of medication, often a failure that may have serious adverse health consequences, may result in loss of a job, may result in long-standing, possibly permanent mental health consequences before getting access to the medication that your doctor prescribed. And I think that that's really quite immoral. There is a conversation we need to have about how these hassle costs, which I'd say an unfortunately large amount of the health economics literature view as an appropriate way of keeping down healthcare costs, really disproportionately impact and harm people with disabilities. So that's an area where I would say the disability rights framework is just very badly needed. Another area I do want to highlight is the chronic pain community is very badly in need of disability rights ideas and disability rights activism. Obviously the United States has really struggled with the problem of opioid use disorders over the course of the last 20 years. But there have been some really severe side effects of efforts to try and reduce the availability of opioids. Many of those side effects have fallen disproportionately on people with chronic pain who are not being given access to effective pain management that is available and that should be available to them. What I think is interesting is, of course, there's a third community that really needs disability rights that is also impacted by these policies, and that's people with substance use disorders. We have seen very, very consistently here that supply reduction, the focus on supply reduction in the context of substance abuse can also have serious unintended consequences. We saw that when access to prescription opioids was severely limited, to abusable prescription opioids was severely limited, heroin overdoses went up very severely. And that's been an issue that's been devastating all kinds of communities across the United States. We have effective means of treating substance use disorders, harm reduction methods, medication-assisted treatment, wide variety of other things. But they ask us to think differently about how to approach these problems in ways that I would say are very familiar to the disability rights movement. So, these are three communities, neither of which that I'm a part of personally, but both of which I feel a moral obligation, and I would say a strategic interest in bringing the disability rights movement to in a bigger way.
Well, wow, that's a lot to keep up with, right? Like this is their way beyond what I can do, right? So for us, in a lot of the work that we're doing in Autism Sprinters, just kind of keeping it small and light. And our focus is really to try to get as many more parents of color to really become civically engaged and really understanding the instrumental of being part of the CPACs and being part of their local disability commissions in their community, just to kind of understand what is happening locally, how is our communities working to improve disability access and improving disability rights within our community, funding sources, helping with the development of inclusive events in our communities, inclusive buildings, when they're being built and things like that. So, a lot of our focus is to focus on that. And I know that a lot of the work we're also kind of working on is also kind of bringing to light, especially how we have a lot of students of color who are disproportionately labeled in our school system as behavior problems versus students who may require a little bit more services, and how we place certain students of color in behavior-based classroom settings and versus sub-separate settings. And we're kind of tackling a lot of that work behind the scenes, more a little low key, and working directly with our superintendent here, especially here in Randolph, Massachusetts. We work in partnership with the parent advisory board. So we meet with our superintendent once a month to kind of just talk about issues within the special education in the district. And, again, just really tackling and getting more parents of color civically engaged to fight for a more definitely equitable disability community, because again, we're very behind in the disability community within just even the language barriers and having information being shared just in multiple different languages when you're servicing families of color. So we're kind of tackling those little things here in Mass and building a lot of partnerships within the Public Health Commission, the Autism Commission department, and, again, just kind of getting into spaces and getting some of our parents into the Department of Ed, Special Education Task Force and things like that. Just so, getting more parents engaged in information sharing and just making sure that they have a voice at the table.
Thanks to you all for that. And I love that you ended it with, getting voices at the table, because that's something that we heard a lot from parents and young adults in the registration process. We asked if people have any questions or any comments. And, this is our Transition of Care Advocacy Summit. And one of the questions that got asked in some variety or comment that was made is that people feel like there's a lot of decisions being made in the medical transition of care for their child, from child neurology care to adult neurology care, that doesn't take the needs of their individual family into account. And so it seems as though we have a lot of families in our community that realize that there isn't enough representation, that it really isn't for us and about us, but that families are really concerned about their limitations, and resources are already strapped and time's already strapped. So I'm wondering if any of you can reflect on how a family that recognizes that advocacy needs to be done in the transitions of care space to make sure that their child or their young adult, or the young adult themselves, is receiving adequate and high quality care when they become an adult and make that transfer. How can they get involved in that kind of advocacy? How can they make sure that they are in the room where decisions are being made? How do you even start doing that?
I would say, for me, a lot of what I at least do in my personal space is to really have open conversations with my son. But I can do that, right? My sons are, one of them is autistic and another one has ADHD, and they're verbal. So we can have verbal conversations and really teaching them what their disability is and defining that disability, and having them say that it's okay that they have ADHD, that they have autism, and making that language normal, right? And for them, we have this conversation all the time where a lot of kids in their classroom were like, what is autism? What is ADHD? And so, they're teaching their peers about a disability. And so I think that for me, I'm constantly pushing my sons to be vocal, sometimes too vocal, because I get calls from schools, right? And I'm like, well, I just taught them to be vocal, but hey. So it's just kind of like letting them kind of speak up for themselves. If they feel like someone's being inappropriate or someone is saying something that's hurtful, I ask them to speak up. I'm always constantly asking my sons, well, what is it that you like about this teacher? What is it that you don't like about this teacher? And like really teaching them to be responsible in expressing themselves, but in a respectful way, right? And so, I encourage that, and I tell this a lot to a lot of our Autism Sprinter parents, is that we have to, especially for our loved ones who have the ability to be verbal, to really verbalize their needs. And I've learned through this process that I remember when I got the diagnosis of being a mom with autism, I felt like I was dealing with my son like textbook smart, right? Like reading, and when I'm not sleeping, I'm researching and I'm reading all these articles, and I'm like literally like dealing with him as if, he was like the DSM-5 description, right? And not dealing with him as an individual. And I learned over time that I wasn't allowing him to tell me who he was and what autism was for him versus what was stipulated on a diagnosis. So as I'm growing in this parent role and so many situations presenting themselves to me, I learned to really not allow my son to define what his disability is for him and move through that. Like, there were some services he didn't like. So as a parent, I felt like, okay, well, this is what they said, this is what a lot of the developmental specialists, and this is what a lot of specialists say that it's going to work, it's going to help improve this disability. But it was a service that he might have not liked. So I had to make the decision, do I stress out my child and then add on different other disabilities that may come down the way, anxiety and all those things that he was developing, because I'm putting him through something that maybe he didn't want to do. So it's just having that open space to allow our loved ones to really dictate what they want to see, and then also challenging systems to think creatively, innovatively, to put systems in place to really think about, like my son he struggles in inclusion, but he also has the skills that may not warrant him to be in a separate classroom. So he's in the middle. He's always been in the middle. So he struggles somewhat socially, so he still has those deficits, but he is also academically, he excels. And he's in the middle. And I've always kind of fought the districts, and I'm like, well, are you guys thinking about those students that are in the middle, the students that don't belong in separate and self-contained classrooms, and those students that don't belong, here in Boston and in Randolph in an inclusion classroom that has like 32, 35 kids in a classroom, right? When a child has autism and they're on overload and it's too much sensory in the classroom. And, kind of like challenging people to think differently, and having my son being able to express himself and say, listen, I got to walk out of this classroom because right now there's too many people moving, too many sounds, I need a break. And just creating those spaces where, I allow my son to be on the driver's seat versus me feeling like I'm dictating what his future is going to look like.
Yeah, I really want to piggyback on some of that. I think it's really important for parents to empower their children and to be honest with them about their disabilities. While some of my disabilities developed or were diagnosed in adulthood, I was born with CP. And my parents were always very honest with me about my CP. And I remember telling people, I have cerebral palsy, spastic diplegia at the age of like 4 or 5. And, I'm this tiny little kid in leg braces with a big mouth going, I have cerebral palsy. And I was never taught that it was shameful, or my parents never tried to hide anything from me. And when it was time for me to start becoming independent, they supported me as best they could. And I find that a lot of my peers who have similar disabilities are not empowered by their parents. Their parents didn't give them the tools they need to be independent. And by independence, I always mean controlling your own lives. I live in my own apartment, with minimal to no support, and I work a full-time job, and that's not going to happen for everybody. But I dictate what goes on in my own life, and there are many people I know who are my age or older, whose parents didn't give them those tools, and who are consequently really stuck, and who, unfortunately, when their parents are gone someday, they're just going to go into an institutional setting and languish there. So I think the biggest lesson for parents is to be honest with their children and empower them and give them those self-advocacy skills.
I think in general, parents often really struggle with separating out the desire to safeguard their children from harm, be it physical or emotional, and the reality that you can't really protect your children forever. No matter who your children are, or what their disabilities are or aren't. And those two conflicting things often lead to a failure to fully inform children with disabilities, and I think that's truly unfortunate. I remember growing up, and I don't often talk about my childhood. I find it's very, at the moment that you start talking about your childhood, people don't want to hear about anything else, which is quite unfortunate. But I'll share one little story. I remember growing up, I was in this pull-out social skills group in my public school. And we were told before we went into this group that you can talk about anything you want, but you can't use the word autism, because one of the students there, his parents, Timothy's parents haven't told him. They don't want him to know. We were in the 7th grade. I am pretty sure that Timothy was aware that there was something different about him. And the reality is that children are not stupid. They are
Mhm.
going to figure out that there is this secret that all the people in their life, that all the important people in their life are hiding from them. And because they are hiding it from them, they will naturally conclude that it is bad. And the inevitable next step, the inevitable next leap in logic there is that they are bad. And that's a very bad message. It's a terrible message for us to be sending to children with disabilities, to really to any child. And so I think you do have an obligation, a moral, ethical obligation as parents to be frank and to communicate with your children about their disabilities, because again, they are going to figure it out. And if you hide things, they are going to internalize your fear in the form of self-loathing. And that is just profoundly unfortunate, and something that really sticks with people throughout their lives.
Yeah, everything that all three of you just said is so powerful and resonates so much with what we hear from people when we talk specifically about transition, that it's really that empowerment piece. If you don't talk to your children early, if you don't share with them and let them take the reins as much as feels comfortable for your family, then when it comes time to know their own medical history or the prescriptions they're on or what have you, it's really difficult for that young adult to advocate for themselves when they no longer see their pediatric neurologist. So I think everything that you're sharing right now is so powerful. I can't believe that we are already at the top of the hour. And so with that, I want to turn it back to you all and ask, is there some, in our last few moments together, is there some wisdom that you would like to impart, or something that we didn't get to talk about that if you were talking, Aria, excuse me, I know you don't like to talk about your childhood, but if you were talking to your 16-year-old self right now, what would you tell yourself about the importance of advocacy and sharing your story in order to set up your adulthood to be the kind of adulthood that you want it to be?
Buy Apple.
Yeah, that, yeah. Let's all get our time machines.
In all seriousness, I would say, when I co-founded ASAN when I was 18, so it would be pretty imminently relevant advice. Content area expertise is ultimately, I think, one of the most valuable things. I think there is a tremendous impulse, tremendous amount of pressure on young people with disabilities to focus on personal narrative. And personal narrative can be very powerful if you need to talk to a legislator, if you need to have a conversation about why some specific point in a larger discussion is especially important. But the problem is that youth with disabilities, they face this pressure to be what Jim Sinclair, the founder of the neurodiversity movement, someone I learned a tremendous amount from, referred to as self-narrating zoo exhibits. So there is this pressure on youth with disabilities to only tell their personal story. And that's very disempowering, because ultimately, when we talk about changing the world, I have yet to meet an elected official or the head of an advocacy organization or anyone of any influence whatsoever who advertises, I'm a terrible person who wants to disempower people with disabilities. No, everyone says that they want to support disability rights. Everyone says they want to be on the side of disabled people. The way you tell the difference between the people who mean it and are delivering for you and your community and the people who are just mouthing words is to have that real content area of expertise. Medicaid,
yes,
IDEA, and the broad array of service systems, legal policy frameworks that impact our lives. So my advice would be hit the books, kid.
Yeah, I really I was like cheering during Ari's speech there, because it's so true. And I find this a lot, that people want me to share my story. And sharing my story is something that I love. Stories in general are something that I love. I'm a writer. I wouldn't be a writer if I didn't love stories. But I have a background in education. I work in fundraising. I can talk about Star Trek. There's so many things that we can be experts on. And so often people just want to invite me to conferences, or invite people with disabilities in general to conferences to tell their stories, and it's like, we're the human content, and, the actual real content for the parents and providers is over there. So I think that is so important, and I get it a lot because, part of my disabilities are fairly visible. So people see me and automatically assume that I must have no idea what I'm talking about, especially because I'm a woman. So I think developing that content area expertise is really, really important. As to my 16-year-old self, there's so many things I'd say to my 16-year-old self, but I would say keep an open mind, and people are more accepting than you think. 16 was when I really, dove really deep into disability community. I kind of discovered it on the internet, discovered many great blogs and essays, Ari's work among them, and I started meeting other people with disabilities. When I was 13, I started going to a summer camp for kids with physical disabilities on Long Island. And by 16, I was like, this is where I am meant to be. I am just going to surround myself with disabled people forever. No non-disabled people are ever going to understand me. And I was having a very difficult time in high school. I did not have friends. And my few moments of joy were when I got to be with other disabled kids, in my adaptive PE class. And it took until probably after college before I really started to come out of that rabbit hole a little bit and realized that if I gave people a chance, they were more accepting than I thought, and they were willing to make accommodations for me and to, accept me for who I was, disabilities and all. I go out to dinner with a couple of non-disabled friends, and the waiter hands you a box to put your own leftovers in. I can't do that. It's going to go all over the table, all over the floor if I try to do that. My friend just takes the box and she just puts my leftovers in it without even asking, because she knows that's what I need. And that's something I don't think I could have conceived of at 16. So my advice would be to definitely, expand your horizons, keep an open mind, and people might surprise you.
Wow. Every time I talk behind them, I'm like, what do I say that hasn't been said? So I think for me, I've always been a natural disruptor. Going through middle school, high school, teachers always told me I was going to be an attorney, a lawyer. So I guess being an advocate is equally as that, right? So I think that if I can kind of go back in times, I would really, tell myself to be a professional civic disruptor, with very, very intentional, very purposeful, and challenge systems to do better. And like Ari says, to come with content and making sure that you have the proper information to challenge these systems, and politicians, because oftentimes in many of these spaces, people speak vaguely. And oftentimes when we create those policies hurt a certain demographics of people more than they help them. And so, if I can go back to 16, I can continuously remind myself that your path is to disrupt systems purposely, intentionally, boldly, and unapologetically.
I love that. And I think that's a great place for us all to end. Again, I wish we could just keep talking all night, but I'm going to hand it over to Katie to give our outro for the evening. Thanks so much to all three of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, and to our panelists, Yahaira, Ari, and Cara. On behalf of CNF and our communities, we're so grateful you've shared with us your time and expertise in this area. As a reminder to all of you, CNF and our partners have more resources on transitions of care available on our website and also on the password protected hub where you access the Zoom link for this talk. Soon you'll be receiving an email thanking you for attending this talk, as well as a brief survey where you can tell us what you thought. We truly appreciate your input. It's invaluable in assisting us in developing future programming and assessing what your needs are. We'd also like to again thank our partners, Acadia, Biogen, Eisai, Genentech, Greenwich, and Zogenix. And we invite you again to help fund our programming if you are able. The greatest feedback is a gift or a donation, so feel free to check out our website, www.childneurologyfoundation.org/donate-online. And there's plenty more summit coming to attend both this week and next. So please join us tomorrow, Wednesday, June 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for our upcoming talk. It's called How Increasing Access to Transition of Care Benefits All of Us. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope that you have a wonderful week.